What happens when the lights go out in a capital city and no one comes to negotiate? Just after midnight on January 3rd, Caracas fell into an unnatural silence. The kind that does not come from peace, but from anticipation. Radar screens flickered, phones stopped ringing. Somewhere above the cloud cover, rotors cut through humid air, unseen, unheard by a city that believed itself protected by distant alliances and hardened power. For years, Venezuela had been presented as untouchable, shielded by Russian-made air defenses, backed by Chinese money, politically fortified by anti-American rhetoric and the illusion of sovereignty. But on this night, none of that mattered, because this was not a war in the traditional sense. No declaration, no ultimatum, no televised countdown. This was something colder, faster, final. Within minutes, precision strikes lit up the outskirts of the capital, not to destroy, but to isolate. Roads vanished into fire, communications went dark, military bases that were supposed to respond instead froze. And while the world waited for confirmation, one fact became impossible to ignore. This was not an invasion designed to topple a system over months or years. This was a single-purpose operation aimed at the very top of the pyramid. The target was not infrastructure, not an army, not even a regime in the abstract. The target was a man. As US aircraft sealed the airspace and electronic warfare smothered Venezuelan defenses, helicopters penetrated deep into sovereign territory more than 200 kilometers inland without resistance. Not because resistance was impossible, but because it never materialized. The defenses that were supposed to fire did not fire. The allies that were supposed to react did not react. The chain of command that was supposed to hold fractured instantly. This was the moment when the old assumptions died. The belief that geography guarantees safety. The belief that great power backing ensures survival. The belief that regime change must be slow, bloody, and chaotic. In less than an hour, all three collapsed. By the time confirmation emerged that President Nicolas Maduro had been captured alive and removed from the Miraflores palace, the operation was already over. No prolonged firefight, no heroic last stand, no negotiated exile, just absence, a sudden vacuum at the very center of power. The symbolism was devastating. A head of state taken from his own bedroom, a palace secured not by loyalists, but by silence. A regime that had spent years projecting defiance reduced to a single unanswered question: how did this happen so fast? For Washington, the message was unmistakable. This was not about Venezuela alone. It was a demonstration, a statement that the United States under President Donald Trump was no longer content with proxy pressure, endless sanctions, or slow-motion destabilization. This was direct action, decisive, deniable, until complete and strategically humiliating for every power that claimed to stand behind Caracas. For Moscow and Beijing, the shock ran deeper, because this was not just the loss of an ally, it was the exposure of a weakness. If Venezuela could fall in minutes under their watch, then what did their guarantees really mean? And for the rest of the world, especially leaders who rely on distant secrecy and foreign protection, the night over Caracas introduced a new fear, one that does not announce itself with missiles or marching troops, but with quiet rotors in the dark. By the time dawn approached Caracas, the operation already had a name circulating quietly through military and intelligence circles: Operation Absolute Resolve. Not because it was loud or overwhelming, but because it was absolute in intent. This was not coercion, not signaling, not pressure. It was execution in the purest strategic sense. The architecture of the operation revealed a doctrine that had been forming for years and was now fully unleashed. Air power did not lead the assault to break defenses. It shaped the environment to make resistance irrelevant. Precision strikes were synchronized not for destruction, but for paralysis. Airfields, communications nodes, and key military compounds were neutralized simultaneously, creating the illusion of omnipresence. Everywhere felt threatened. Nowhere felt safe. Above Caracas, fifth-generation fighters established an invisible ceiling. Stealth aircraft did not need to dominate the skies. In a traditional dogfight, they denied the sky itself. Venezuelan radar systems, long advertised as among the densest in Latin America, failed to produce a coherent picture. Operators reportedly saw noise fragments, digital ghosts. Whether by cyber intrusion, electronic warfare, or deliberate shutdown from within, the result was the same blindness. This was the critical shift. In earlier eras, regime change operations relied on overwhelming force and prolonged campaigns. Here, force was minimal but perfectly timed. The true weapon was certainty. Every unit on the ground, every commander waiting for orders, face the same calculation: respond blindly and die, or do nothing and survive. In that moment, survival won. The insertion phase was brutally efficient. Heavy lift helicopters flew low and fast, exploiting corridors that had been cleared not by bombing, but by fear. The extraction force was not a conventional assault unit, but a hybrid team special operators paired with law enforcement personnel. That detail mattered. This was not framed internally as a battlefield kill mission. It was an arrest. Inside the Miraflores Palace, there were no negotiations, no declarations broadcast to the nation, no call for loyalists to defend the president. The operation moved room by room, target-focused, disciplined. The objective was not dominance, it was control. Capture the individual, remove the symbol, collapse the system by removing its keystone. What followed was perhaps the most destabilizing moment of all confirmation that there were 0 American casualties, no martyrs, no visible sacrifice. That fact alone magnified the humiliation for Venezuela's allies. It suggested not just superiority, but asymmetry so vast that resistance never entered the equation. From Washington's perspective, the messaging was calibrated and cold. Statements emphasized legality, precision, and restraint. There was no victory parade, no triumphalist rhetoric, just a short confirmation that the objective had been achieved. The silence afterward was intentional. It forced others to speak first and reveal their weakness. For Russia and China, the operation raised a question they could not answer publicly. How could an ally so deeply integrated into their security and economic networks collapse without even a symbolic defense? No intercepted missiles, no scrambled fighters, no last stand by foreign advisors. The absence was louder than any explosion. Operation Absolute Resolve did not just remove a leader, it erased the illusion that modern power requires prolonged violence. It proved that in a hyper-connected battle space, speed, intelligence, dominance, and psychological shock can do what armies once could not. And it left behind a new reality. If a regime can be decapitated in under an hour, then time itself has become a weapon. The most unsettling question was not how the operation succeeded, but why no one tried to stop it. For years, Venezuela had been marketed as a fortified node of the so-called multipolar world. Russian S-300 systems, Chinese radar arrays, foreign advisors, layers of deterrence meant to signal that any direct strike would trigger escalation. Yet on the night of January 3rd, that entire architecture collapsed without a single missile fired in anger. From a strategic standpoint, this was checkmate without a battle. One explanation lies in technological dominance. Modern American warfare no longer seeks to overwhelm defenses, it seeks to render them irrelevant. Electronic warfare, cyber intrusion, and sensor fusion can blind an opponent before the first shot is fired. If radar operators cannot distinguish reality from digital deception, decision-making freezes. In that paralysis window measured in minutes, not hours, outcomes are decided. The Venezuelan air defense network may have still existed physically, but functionally it was in a coma. But technology alone does not explain the silence. The more dangerous possibility is betrayal, or more precisely, strategic abandonment. Power structures under pressure often collapse inward. When elites sense that the end is inevitable, loyalty becomes conditional. Orders are delayed. Systems are left offline. Critical minutes pass. In such moments, the most powerful force is not fear of the enemy, but fear of being on the wrong side of history. For Moscow, the calculation was brutal. Russia was already overstretched, tied down by years of grinding war in Eastern Europe, dependent on external ammunition supplies and facing economic pressure at home. Projecting force across the Atlantic to save an embattled ally was never realistic. Silence in this context was not weakness, it was triage. Venezuela became a disposable pawn. Beijing's dilemma was different, but equally constraining. China's investments in Venezuela were massive, but economic influence is not a substitute for military readiness. Confrontation in the Western Hemisphere would have forced Beijing into a crisis far from its core priorities: Taiwan, the South China Sea, and regional stability in East Asia. Choosing not to react was a strategic retreat masked as diplomatic caution. What made this moment so devastating for both powers was the comparison it invited. Russia's own special military operation was supposed to demonstrate speed, decisiveness, and inevitability. Instead, it became a prolonged attritional conflict. The contrast was unavoidable. One operation dragged on for years. The other ended before sunrise. This disparity shattered credibility. Allies around the world quietly took notes. Security guarantees are only as strong as the willingness to enforce them. On January 3rd, those guarantees failed a live fire test. The absence of resistance from foreign mercenaries and advisors reinforced the message. When survival odds collapse, ideology evaporates. Contracts end. Uniforms come off. The battlefield did not need to be cleared, it emptied itself. Strategically, this was not just a defeat for Venezuela, it was a systemic failure for the Eastern Bloc's promise of protection. The king was removed and the board froze. No countermove followed, because no countermove existed. And in that silence, a new hierarchy of power became visible, one defined not by numbers, but by the ability to act decisively while others hesitate. What unfolded over Caracas did not occur in isolation. It fit a pattern, one that has been emerging across multiple theaters of conflict from Eastern Europe to the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific. The lesson was not about geography, it was about method. In Ukraine, the world witnessed the limits of mass attrition and conventional escalation. There, time favored the defender, and protracted conflict eroded prestige on all sides. In contrast, the Caracas operation demonstrated what happens when time is weaponized instead of consumed. Speed replaced scale. Intelligence replaced brute force. The objective was not territory, but decision-making collapse. A similar logic has been visible in the shadow war between Israel and Iran. Strikes that are precise, deniable, and targeted at leadership or critical nodes, not armies, have reshaped deterrence. Escalation is managed not by restraint, but by ambiguity. The message is delivered without fingerprints, forcing adversaries into a dilemma: respond and risk exposure, or absorb the blow and appear weak. The United States has now applied this model openly, and that matters. In the context of US-China rivalry, the implications are profound. Beijing has long relied on the assumption that distance and complexity would slow American response, that any major intervention would require coalition building, prolonged deployment, and political exhaustion. Caracas shattered that assumption. It showed that under the right conditions, decisive action can be taken unilaterally, quickly, and with minimal political cost. For Taiwan, this was a warning shot without a missile. If leadership decapitation is possible in a heavily protected capital, then contingency planning changes overnight. The burden shifts from preventing invasion to ensuring continuity of command. Survival becomes less about fortifications and more about resilience. Even in the Middle East, where power balances are traditionally fragile, the message resonated. Regimes that rely on layered proxies and external patrons now face a sobering reality. Patrons may calculate that silence is cheaper than intervention. Alliances are no longer ironclad, they are conditional. What ties these theaters together is a shift away from ideological confrontation and toward operational dominance. This is not about exporting democracy or reshaping societies. It is about controlling outcomes with minimal exposure. Power is exercised not through occupation, but through precision disruption. And yet this convergence also carries risk. When operations are clean and fast, the threshold for action lowers. The temptation to solve strategic problems through surgical force grows stronger. The danger is not escalation through overreaction, but normalization of intervention. Caracas, Ukraine, Tehran, Taipei. These are not separate stories. They are chapters in a single narrative about how power is now applied. Less noise, less warning, fewer rules. The question facing the world is not whether this model works. January 3rd proved that it does. The question is how often it will be used and against whom. Because once a precedent is set, it does not stay contained. When the helicopters disappeared into the darkness, the real impact began not in command centers or briefing rooms, but in living rooms, streets, and markets. Caracas woke up to an absence. No presidential address, no reassuring speech from the palace balcony, just rumors moving faster than facts, and a city trying to understand what had happened while it slept. For ordinary Venezuelans, the shock was visceral. Years of propaganda had promised protection, resilience, defiance. Yet the regime collapsed in a single night without a fight. Soldiers stayed in their barracks. Police waited for instructions that never came. Ministries closed their doors. In authoritarian systems, fear flows downward from the top. When the top vanishes, paralysis spreads. Beyond Venezuela's borders, the psychological tremor was even stronger. In neighboring capitals, phones rang through the night. Leaders who had aligned themselves rhetorically with Caracas now faced an uncomfortable question: if it happened there, could it happen here? The idea that distance or ideology could guarantee safety no longer felt convincing. The economic shockwaves followed quickly. Venezuela holds some of the world's largest proven oil reserves, long constrained by sanctions mismanagement and geopolitical bargaining. Overnight uncertainty replaced stagnation. Markets reacted not just to potential supply changes, but to what control over those reserves might now mean. Energy traders recalculated scenarios. Oil-producing states reassessed leverage. Every dollar shift in oil prices carried strategic consequences far beyond Latin America. For Russia, the implications were stark. Its economy remains deeply tied to energy revenues. Any future flood of Venezuelan oil into global markets would undermine Moscow's pricing power and weaken its ability to finance prolonged conflict abroad. What had once been a distant ally now looked like a liability that had slipped from its grasp. China faced a different kind of loss. Years of investment infrastructure planning and political capital in Venezuela suddenly appeared fragile. Projects that relied on regime continuity ports, logistics hubs, long-term energy agreements were now subject to renegotiation or collapse. The perception of reliability so critical to Beijing's global strategy took a hit that no official statement could fully repair. But the deepest impact was human. Regime change, even bloodless, creates uncertainty. Jobs disappear, institutions stall, families wait to see which flag will be raised over familiar buildings. Hope and fear coexist uneasily. Some see opportunity, others brace for chaos. The absence of gunfire does not mean the absence of cost. This is the paradox of modern power. Precision minimizes casualties in the moment, but it cannot erase the long shadow that follows. Lives are disrupted not by bombs, but by sudden shifts in authority. Stability becomes provisional. And as people in Caracas, Moscow, Beijing, and Washington all absorbed the consequences in different ways, one truth became clear: the operation's success did not end the story. It started a reckoning. By the end of that week, the meaning of January 3rd had crystallized into something far larger than the fate of a single leader or a single country. What unfolded in Caracas was a demonstration of restored American strategic prestige, quiet, unapologetic, and unmistakable. Not prestige built on speeches or summits, but on the ability to act while others calculated. Under President Donald Trump, the United States signaled a return to a doctrine many believed had faded credibility through decisive power. For years, adversaries tested red lines, assuming hesitation, fragmentation, and domestic fatigue would restrain Washington. Caracas suggested otherwise. It showed that when the decision is made, execution is swift, and the window for response is non-existent. This raised a fundamental tension that now defines the global order's security versus freedom. Operations like this promise security through control, through speed, through the removal of perceived threats before they metastasize. But they also narrow the space for sovereignty, for political ambiguity, for nations attempting to balance between competing powers. The gray zone is shrinking. For allies, the message was reassuring but unsettling. Protection is real but conditional. Alignment matters more than rhetoric. For rivals, the lesson was harsher. Deterrence no longer rests solely on weapon stockpiles or public alliances, but on resilience, loyalty, and internal cohesion. A regime that fractures internally can fall faster than any missile defense system can react. The precedent is what lingers. If leadership capture becomes normalized, if decapitation replaces deterrence, then the rules of engagement have changed. The cost-benefit analysis of power shifts toward action rather than restraint. That does not make the world safer. It makes it faster. And in a fast world, mistakes travel at the speed of helicopters in the dark. America's strategic prestige may have been restored, but prestige is not stability. It invites both respect and resistance. Others will adapt. They will harden systems, disperse. Leadership deepen mistrust. The cycle will continue sharper and more dangerous each time. So the final question remains unresolved. Was January 3rd a necessary correction in a world drifting toward disorder, or the opening move of a future where sovereignty is provisional and power answers only to speed? And if this is the new normal, who decides when the rotors start turning next? The January 3rd operation in Caracas marked a decisive turning point in modern geopolitics. In a single night, the United States demonstrated a new model of power, fast, precise, and focused on leadership removal rather than prolonged warfare. Venezuela's collapse exposed the fragility of security guarantees offered by Russia and China, undermining the credibility of the multipolar order they championed. Strategically, the operation echoed patterns seen in Ukraine, the Middle East, and the US-China rivalry, where intelligence dominance and speed increasingly outweigh mass and attrition. Economically, it sent shockwaves through energy markets and threatened the financial lifelines of adversarial states. Human consequences followed as Venezuelans and regional leaders alike faced uncertainty in the vacuum left behind. Above all, the operation restored American strategic prestige while raising uncomfortable questions about precedent. If power can be exercised so cleanly and quickly, the threshold for intervention drops. The world is left grappling with a new reality, one where security is enforced not through deterrence alone, but through decisive action that leaves little room for response.